They were saying in Japan, bring it on. You know, we want it as soon as possible. There's 100 million people here ready to die for the emperor.
As horrible as dropping the bombs were, the fact that it sort of rips the Band-Aid off and gets this war over with as quickly as possible prevents much wider destruction in Asia as a whole.
But let's say the Manhattan Project isn't ready in time and the bombs aren't there. This is your only plan, isn't it?
You look at the scale of deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and subsequently, they pale into insignificance compared to the deaths that would have occurred in Japan and to the Allies if they'd have landed. It's going to be an absolute bloodbath.
So you might have had an opportunity to wrong foot them and just go directly into the Kanto Plain, and because that is where the bulk of Japan's population is, that's where the bulk of the remaining manufacturing is. Just go right in and, you know, decapitate the government and win.
Had the Americans been focused on reducing Japan, you'll have seen the French, the British, and the Dutch saying, you know what, we're going to reimpose our empire now.
Operation Downfall was the audacious Allied plan to invade Japan near the end of World War II, featuring two massive phases: Operation Olympic to capture Kyushu and Operation Coronet to storm Honshu. The stage was set by the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, where over 300 warships and hundreds of thousands of personnel clashed in the Philippine Sea. This decisive battle aimed to liberate the Philippines and cut Japan's vital supply lines. Despite the Japanese Navy's desperate tactics, the Allies secured a monumental victory, paving the way for Japan's ultimate defeat and showcasing the sheer power and strategy of the Pacific War. Yet, Operation Downfall never unfolded. Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war. Had it proceeded, it would have been one of history's largest amphibious assaults, highlighting the colossal logistical, strategic, and human challenges of the war's final chapter. I'm James Hanson, this is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's Operation Downfall, a monumental operation that would have required some of the largest amphibious assaults in history. In the end, the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima forced Japan to surrender, and the plan was never put into action. But what if the atomic bombs weren't ready, or Truman had decided not to drop them? What if the Allied plan went ahead, leading to a full-scale invasion of Japan? That's a question for our experts, and joining me today, as always, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel is World War II scholar and author Jonathan Parshall. Welcome to you both. Now in front of us we have our big map of the Pacific Theatre as it would have been towards the end of the Second World War. John Parshall, to start with you, I mean, obviously we know the real history of what happened with the atomic bomb, but just remind us of how the closing phases of the Pacific War played out.
Sure. So we invaded the island of Okinawa in April of 1945. We secure that island by the end of June 1945, and we're going to use that as a staging base and an air base to exert air control over southern Kyushu. And we're looking at southern Kyushu as being the first potential landing spot to work our way up to Tokyo. Reason being, we always want to be underneath our land-based air power. And so we can't make one leap up to Tokyo. That's too far away. We're going to have to do it in two steps, hence the need for two operations. Olympic to get into Kyushu, and then Coronet to make the final jump up to Tokyo. So we're massing these forces. We're also starting to bring over a large number of troops from Europe. Now that the war there is over, we're going to be building up those forces, bringing those divisions across from Europe, and also bringing 8th Air Force over from Europe as well to emplace all of that material on Okinawa and then use that as the jumping point to go up to Kyushu itself.
And one thing we should mention as well, Chris, is what the Soviets are doing, because they've gone into Manchuria.
Absolutely. That's towards the end of the war. I mean, I think what's also significant in what John has said is the fact that the Japanese know exactly where the Americans are going to land because they say, look, if you look at our topography, if we are going to land anywhere, it's these 35 beaches in Kyushu here. We also think they might land in Tokyo Bay because that's what we do. And so they've actually anticipated. They've also got the timing right because originally the Kyushu operation was designed to be about the 1st of November or 1st of December. The Japanese think, well, hang on, it's taken them 3 months to get in to Okinawa. They'll probably do it about that time. There's another reason for doing it about that time as well. It's the end of the typhoon season. And the Japanese absolutely get it right in terms of where it's going to be, when it's going to be. And the Tokyo Bay operation was going to be in March 1946. Now, as it happens, had the Americans gone for 1st of November, they'd have been hit by a typhoon on the way in. And of course, that is deep in the Japanese memory. The whole kamikaze thing, of course, is the divine wind, the typhoon that comes and actually kills off Kublai Khan's invasion. So this almost looks like history repeating itself. So the Japanese get it exactly right. They're worried about the Russians. They've been keeping an eye on the Russians up in Vladivostok throughout the war. And we've got to remember that all the time the war's been going on, there's been supply ships coming in past Japan to actually keep the Soviet Union on its feet. It's coming from America. So it's a really odd situation. But basically, Stalin has said, look, we'll come in on your side. He knows about the atomic bomb. He knows about the Manhattan Project because there are spies inside the system. He's trying to time his moment. Where the Japanese are really sensitive is, as you say, Manchuria itself, where they got the bulk of their troops, and where the Russians have the bulk of their forces. But the real Achilles heel is Sakhalin Island here. Because if the Russians go there, and eventually they send 100,000 troops there, the Japanese think that the Russians can mount an invasion of Hokkaido in the north here within 10 days. Whether they would or not is debatable. I don't think they had the amphibious capability, but that is a neurosis that the Japanese have, that the Russians might come into the north even before the Americans and the Australians get into the south.
And I suppose, John, what's really interesting here is the way the Pacific theatre is almost like a kind of mirror of the European theatre, where the Germans should have long since surrendered. You know, it shouldn't have taken until May 1945 for the Germans to have surrendered. The writing had been on the wall for ages. And the same is true in the Pacific theatre, but partly because of kind of Japanese culture and military doctrine that says you do not surrender, they are just refusing to do so.
Yeah, we find ourselves in a really sort of surreal situation here where, yes, the Japanese military culture, we typically, when we go into an island and try to take that place over, we have to kill about 97 to 98% of the garrison that is on that island before we can finally call that place secure. And this, obviously leads to some pretty terrible math when you're thinking about, invading a place as big as Kyushu. The other thing that's going on is that the Japanese are stuck in what I call a delusional feedback loop, in that they think that they're actually doing better in this war than they are. Okay, yeah, we've lost a lot of territory, but particularly with the advent of the kamikazes, they start trotting out just ludicrous claims for how many ships have been sunk by their aircraft and so forth and so on, because they're getting these crazy sighting reports from a lot of their aviators that, we saw all these smoke columns, so we must have sunk 10 carriers or something like that. So if you start believing your own press releases, right, that then leads to you doubling down on what are actually strategically ineffective tactics, which the kamikaze was, and leading you to then want to prolong this war even further. So, yeah, we as the Americans and the Allies are in this terrible situation where we've got a beaten enemy who doesn't think he's beaten. And until you can convince that enemy that they are, in fact, beaten, what ability do you have to actually compel them to surrender? You don't. They have to be, the Japanese have to be the ones to finally realize this is actually a disastrous war and we do need to surrender. And we just haven't gotten here yet.
There's something else, though, as well. Which I'm sure John knows about, is we said to the Germans and to the Japanese, we want unconditional surrender. And one of the reasons the Germans hold out for so long is because we're offering them nothing. it's the same with the Japanese. And if you look at all the propaganda within Japan, the Japanese are saying, you think we're bad? The Americans are even worse. What they're going to do to us is beyond anything we can imagine. And there's this constant drumbeat of propaganda about what happens if the islands are invaded. We've got to remember, it hasn't been invaded successfully over the centuries. This is something we totally new to the Japanese.
And we'll come on to the debate around whether Truman was right to drop the bomb in a moment. But John, just talk us through the timeline here. When does the first bomb get dropped, and talk us through what happens from there?
Sure. The first atomic bomb gets dropped on the city of Hiroshima on the morning of 6 August. And then just 2 days later, the Soviets announced that they didn't actually announce. They had announced that they were abrogating their neutrality pact. And then lo and behold, they invade Manchuria on 8th August. And then just the next day, 9 August, the second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. And that is going to lead to a climactic meeting then on the evening of 10 August, where the big six, who are the prime minister, the foreign minister, the heads of the army, and their two chiefs of staff, who are really the six guys who are in charge of running Japan, are at a deadlock as to whether or not they're going to accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender. And they go to the emperor and they basically say to the emperor, we're at a deadlock. What's your opinion? That is the evening where the emperor is going to weigh in decisively and say, we're done. We're surrendering. We're going to accept Potsdam. That is then going to lead to a great deal of internal kerfuffle, and there's going to be an attempted coup during the 12th, 13th, and 14th, where some elements in the Japanese army are like, no, we have to prevent the emperor from surrendering. They actually come into the imperial palace. People are hiding. They've hidden the recording of the emperor where he's going to announce his surrender. Eventually, that coup is put down, and the emperor then will announce his surrender on the morning of the 15th.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the debates around the rights or wrongs of dropping the bomb. From your perspective, Chris Parry, do you think Truman was absolutely right?
Well, I mean, I think what one has to do here is say, right, what are the consequences? And we're going to discuss those if the bombs hadn't been used. Yeah. And you look at the scale of deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and subsequently, they pale into insignificance compared to the deaths that would have occurred in Japan and to the Allies if they'd have landed, and more broadly within the rest of the Asia-Pacific region. You've got to remember, a large number of Japanese soldiers are marooned on these islands for a start, so they're going to die. You've got a load of sort of natives who've been taken over by the Japanese who are really under the cosh. We're in an area of starvation here. The Japanese are actually eating people at this stage, rather than because they can't be supplied by their own forces. And so the level of deprivation throughout this area is absolutely huge. And so in terms of morality, if you're a military man, you're saying, look, I want to save my own troops and my sailors. But also, there's a huge population here. Oh, and by the way, there's 285,000 of our people in Japan who they are going to kill to the last person if we invade. So best we get it over with as soon as we can.
Well, that's a really good point, and I want to bring you in on this, John. First of all, because you kind of agree with Chris, don't you, very strongly, that
absolutely
there is a humanitarian argument for dropping it.
Yeah. So the problem is from a modern day analytical standpoint, I think most people tend to frame this debate in terms of American lives saved at the expense of Japanese civilian lives lost by the dropping of those bombs. But what they fail to realize is just the scale of human devastation going on in wider Asia. By the time you get to the middle of 1945, the numbers are squishy, but rough math says that between 500 and 700,000 people are dying every month in Asia, and 3/4 of those are allies, okay, mostly civilians, either in China that are being killed by direct military action by the Japanese army, or civilians in both Vietnam and Indonesia who are on the receiving end of massive starvations that are being aided and abetted by the Japanese military that is hoarding food. So every month that this war goes on, we are in essence killing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of allied civilians in the process. And so as horrible as dropping the bombs were, the fact that it sort of rips the Band-Aid off and gets this war over with as quickly as possible prevents much wider destruction in Asia as a whole. And then with respect to Japan specifically, by removing the threat of direct invasion, which was going to kill millions of Japanese, I'm here to tell you, it also takes that off the plate as well. So as awful as the bombs were, they were the least bad solution to get this war over as quickly as possible.
And Chris, politically, in a way, Truman almost had to drop the bombs in the sense that had the war dragged on into, and we'll come on to what would have happened had Operation Downfall played out, but had the war dragged on into 1946, 1947, many more American lives being lost, it would be politically very damaging for him if people then realised, hang on, you had this weapon which could have ended the war in 1945. Absolutely,
and I think that is actually discussed by Truman and his advisors at the time. They say, well, what if we don't use it? How are we going to face the American people in future? And all this happens afterwards, because they've already done their damage assessments and how many people they're likely to lose. And some of these things are off the scale. I mean, one of the assessments says we're going to lose 1.4 million of our troops. That is totally off the scale, out of all proportion to any other sort of amphibious or other campaign in the rest of the Second World War. So in retrospect, if they'd had the weapon, then it would have been a problem. Now, here's another thing, is that Japanese have got their own atomic program going at this time. And although it was nowhere near being able to produce a bomb because they didn't have the resources and they hadn't actually proved the theory of it, it's not to say the Soviets might not have come along with a bomb at some stage.
Interesting, yes.
Because we know they had one within 5 years, having got access to the secrets. So how long do you keep this under wraps before you say, well, actually, I've got it and I need to use it or test it at some stage?
Talking of the Soviets, John, what is your response to those who say that the Japanese surrender was not all about the atomic bombs and was, to some extent, about what the Soviets were up to in Manchuria and the threat of a Soviet invasion of Japan?
Sure. I think that there's no question that there was a tremendous impact on the Imperial Army's leadership when it becomes clear the scale of the disaster that the Soviets are foisting upon the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, which had been probably the most powerful formation within the Imperial Army. But by the time you get to the end of 1945 or the middle of 45, that army has been gutted. A lot of its formations have been moved out to island garrisons and destroyed out there. But no question that when the Soviets sweep into Manchuria and start destroying that army, there are a lot of repercussions in the upper echelon of the Imperial Army. I tend to downplay the importance of the Soviet invasion. I think it is important, but to my way of thinking, it is really the second atomic bomb at Nagasaki, which convinced the Big Six that, okay, this is not, Hiroshima was not an outlier. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a science experiment that the Americans shoveled out of an airplane on top of us. And no, it looks like this thing is actually a weapon that is in serial production, and the Americans are going to use it against us. And honestly, the timing of the two drops was very intentional on our part. By spacing it so closely, we are trying, in essence, to bluff, because we don't have a third atomic bomb. It's not going to be ready for another few weeks. I forget the exact timing. But we are trying to bluff them into thinking that, yeah, this is something we have in serial production and you better fold right now. And it works.
In fact, if you look at the discussions, the minutes of the Imperial Diet at the time, they actually say, how many do we think the Americans have got?
Yes.
They actually have that discussion.
And could Tokyo be next?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right. That whole thing, and quite a few of them say they've only got one. And John's right. The minute the Nagasaki bomb goes down, they go, if they got two, they may have 3, 4, 5. And they say Tokyo could be next, Kyoto could be next. And it's that cascading logic, if you like, that comes off the back of the Nagasaki bomb. But there is a very, very lively discussion about how many they've got, and a suspicion they may only have one.
Well, of course, there was a plan for if the bombs weren't ready or Truman didn't get dropped, Operation Downfall. So let's explore that now and how that may have played out. Okay, well, we've talked about the reality of what happened with the dropping of the atomic bombs. Let's talk about what the other plan was, which was Operation Downfall, which essentially means the invasion of Japan if they still were not surrendering, or maybe the atomic bombs weren't dropped because Truman decided not to, or let's say they weren't ready. First things first, let's briefly just talk about the geography of the Japanese islands. So you've got Kyushu, which is the island where Nagasaki is in the south of Japan. You then got Honshu as well, which is the main island where you've got Hiroshima, but also the capital, Tokyo, and then Hokkaido, which is the northernmost of the islands. And we're going to get into the specifics of Downfall in a moment because it's broken up into two parts, Olympic and Coronet. And John's going to talk us through how they would have worked. But in broad brushstrokes, Chris, talk to us about the kind of the wider strategic aim of Downfall. Essentially, invade and force the Japanese to surrender that way.
Yes, it's sequential, not synchronized, though. The idea was that we take over the bottom third of the island of Kyushu. That was in order to get some air bases that then could be used to operate throughout the rest of Japan. That was going to take place November, December 1945. And then about March 1946, another invasion would take place in Tokyo Bay. And what you have to remember here is that the options for where you land are actually quite limited because of the geography and also everything else that's going on in Japan at the time to do with the demographics and to do with where the agricultural elements are and things like that. The other thing worth mentioning, of course, is that from August, the Soviets are in.
Yes.
And so they, at some stage, would have had something to play. They've occupied Sakhalin, this island here, and they will be pressurizing from the north. And of course, they'll be playing it according to their own agenda. So they're a bit of a wild card in all this, but they are pressurizing the Japanese from the north. Now, what's been brought together is probably the largest concentration of military force ever, including today. It would have involved two massive amphibious landings covered by a large numbers of carriers, battleships and supporting ships. And of course, the Japanese had a defense plan for it. But essentially in the south, Kyushu, that's Operation Olympic there, and Operation Coronet in 1946 in Tokyo Bay. Both involve a massive transfer of logistics across the Pacific, and of course, a huge weight of firepower about to hit the Japanese.
On that note, let's zoom in and let's ask ourselves how Operation Olympic would have played out. Now, Operation Downfall, we know, was estimated to have been the largest and deadliest amphibious assault in history. If it had gone ahead, over 1.8 million Allied troops, backed by approximately 40 aircraft carriers, at least 12 battleships and more than 400 destroyers, were set to face 3 million Japanese soldiers, with millions of civilians trained as part of militia forces and 10,000 kamikaze aircraft. Allied casualties were projected to have been between 1 and 2 million, with Japanese military losses estimated to have been between 2 and 4 million, and a staggering 5 to 10 million civilian deaths. Now, obviously, these are just projections, they never actually played out, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. Kamikaze attacks, suicide boats, and brutal urban combat in cities like Tokyo and Osaka would have made the operation a bloodbath, and the sheer scale of destruction was averted by Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war. Now, John, we've got a brilliant map that you have very kindly provided for us in front of us now, showing what the kind of plan was for Operation Olympic, which was the first part of Operation Downfall, focusing on the island of Kyushu. Do you want to talk us through what the plan involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a nutshell, what we're planning to do here is use 3 different amphibious corps of 3+ divisions apiece to land on various points around sort of the southern perimeter of Kyushu. We're not going to try to capture this whole island. We only need the southern half of it to establish the air bases. But the basic math is relatively simple. We're going to come in with about 800,000 personnel in the initial landings, backed up by about 7,000 aircraft. And the assumption is that we're going to be going up against maybe 350,000 Japanese personnel and 2,500 Japanese aircraft, some component of which are going to be kamikazes, of course. And the truth of the matter is that when this plan was put together at the beginning of 1945, the math worked. The problem, as Chris alluded to earlier, is that it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where it was that the Americans were going to be coming ashore in Kyushu. And the Japanese make the decision in March of 1945 to absolutely bet the ranch on the outcome of this battle. And so what ends up happening is they just pump newly raised divisions into Kyushu. And so if we fast forward up until about July of 1945, and understand that there's some delay, it takes us a while to pick up the radio transmissions and start identifying these new units that start coming in. But by the time you get to July of 1945, the Japanese have increased their troop count to nearly 900,000 soldiers and around 10,000 aircraft, meaning that, now we're going to be doing this amphibious landing at barely 1-to-1, which is not the recipe for success that you want when you're coming ashore on a beach. You typically want to be fighting at 3-to-1 over your opponent, and we're not going to get that. And so it's pretty clear that there was going to be a significant come-to-Jesus meeting between the Army and the Navy. MacArthur is absolutely dead set on running this invasion of Kyushu because he's going to be the guy who's in charge of it, and he wants the laurels from that. And on the other side, you've got King and Nimitz who are like, this is a terrible idea. We do not want to have to go into an invasion at a 1-to-1 force ratio. And, there was, as I say, going to be a come-to-Jesus meeting. We will never know what the outcome of that was because it never took place. But there are a lot of warning signs coming up in Allied intelligence by about July.
Chris, do you want to talk to us about how the Japanese were preparing for such an invasion? Because, of course, at this point, they don't know that the bombs are going to be dropped. And so this is what they are expecting. How are they preparing?
Japanese have learned a lot of lessons in the last year. And they've looked at the way the Americans assault places. And they've said, look, we're not going to fight them on the beaches. We're going to actually go well back outside the bombardment range of the big warships. We're also going to hide in caves. We're going to have a lot of emplacements in these mountains here. And we really don't like the flame-throwing tanks that the Americans use. So we're going to go high. We're not going to fight them down on the plains or dig trenches or anything like that. They've also got together a large number of suicide elements. So there's about 38 submarines operational at the time. So they're going to be around these waters here. So that's going to be pretty difficult to flush them out. They've got about 250 mini-subs of various types. They've also got 4,000 suicide frogmen. They've got Kaitan, about 1,000 Kaitan human torpedoes, all being deployed down here.
And then these human torpedoes, I mean, this is a suicide mission. This is a kamikaze. I mean, human torpedoes were used by the British, for example, but in a very different way.
Absolutely. Yeah. The idea is you actually ride it to the end, so there's no question about that. There's no other guidance system. And they specifically said, when we get an invasion, forget the warships. Okay, we're going for the troop transport and the supply ships. They've learned all these lessons. And in fact, if you look at the way the Japanese have actually thought about this, it is a classic counter-amphibious operation. You couldn't do better today in terms of that. And so there's all sorts of things that are going to get in the way of getting ashore in the first place and then fighting up the islands as far as you want to go to get the airfields. And so it's going to be an absolute bloodbath in terms of getting ashore and establishing yourself. And frankly, unless you've got the mass to do that, you're never going to achieve it, and you may be thrown back. If you look at the invasion of Okinawa, so offshore there, the American and Australian ships, 380 were damaged, 36 were sunk. Now, the Americans anticipated initially they're going to lose 95 ships in this invasion. I think that is a conservative estimate, given what they were going to be up against. And on top of that, this area is going to be mined. So that's a pretty hefty bill.
Well, on that note, John, what do you think the Americans would have been looking at in terms of, casualties and in terms of, supplies lost and damage sustained? I mean, this was a huge ask.
Yeah, and I don't have a crystal ball that's big enough to, give you a number. I absolutely echo Chris's statements that this is going to be an absolute bloodbath. From an air defense standpoint, one of the advantages that we have with our carrier force off of a place like Okinawa is that we got a lot of open water that we can operate over, which means that our intercept distances out to these incoming kamikaze raids, it could be 50, 60, 70 miles. That's not going to be the case off the invasion beaches here. And as Chris is absolutely correct in stating, the Japanese have changed their doctrine away from trying to hit our very well-defended carriers and towards, well, let's go pick on the attack transports, which are big and slow, don't have the organic firepower to beat off air attacks. So imagine, if you will, you've got these transports moored a couple miles offshore. The Japanese are launching kamikaze planes from caves or, forests. They're taking off of roads, and they're over land for most of their transit until they get to the landing beach. And now I've only got 2, 3, 4 miles worth of water to zoom over, and then I'm going to hit this big slow transport. How do you defend against that? It was going to be very, very difficult. And I think Chris is absolutely right that we would have lost a lot of vessels, and a lot of them would have been packed with Allied troops. So, yeah. The other thing I would say, once you get ashore, all of these beaches, all 3 of those amphibious cores are isolated from each other. And if you've ever been down to Kyushu, it's very, very hilly and mountainous. Somehow we're going to have to link up all of these beachheads and turn them into a contiguous beachhead. But the problem is that all these hill passes that you would have to take in order to sew those things together, man, you plunk down one company of Japanese infantry at the top of these paths, and they could probably hold off a division for a week or so. So, yeah, it's going to be really, really ugly warfare. There's going to be tremendous civilian casualties. Because, again, if you look at what happened on Okinawa, where half of the civilian population ends up dead, that was 300,000 civilians. Project that forward to Kyushu, where you have something on the order of 3 or 4 million civilians. Boy.
I mean, I think it's worth stressing how many kamikazes there are likely to be out there, because, there were probably about 2,000 at Okinawa. There are 12,500 aircraft available, even if they're not used all as kamikazes, and they have 19,000 pilots available to do that duty. They've trained them up. So this is a huge mass attack. And as John says, the difficulties before you get a thing called a moving target indicator on a radar of actually detecting these things coming around the islands and over. It's exactly the same problem we had in San Carlos in the Falklands. They were popping up just 2 miles away, and we were trying to shoot them down. So I've been there. So this is of a scale 100 times greater than San Carlos would have been.
And John, just talk us through the timeline here, because had Olympic worked, and we'll come on to whether it would have worked, but had it worked, the next stage was Operation Coronet.
That's right. Yeah, so Olympic is supposed to go down at the beginning of November 1945, and we're going to secure that place within a couple of months. We're going to put our airfields up, get them in business, move the aircraft into them, and then extend that air envelope up north to the Kanto Plain around Tokyo, and then Coronet is supposed to go in around March of 1946.
And do you think it would have proceeded in that timeline, or was that timeline, in your view, wildly overambitious?
Yeah, I think that given the incredible increase in the number of Japanese troops that end up in southern Kyushu, that is going to precipitate that come to Jesus meeting that never happened. I am confident in our abilities amphibiously. I think we would have been able to land our forces, but we might have had the equivalent of a gigantic Anzio operation where, the forces get ashore, but we've got these 3 isolated beachheads and we can't sew them all together because the resistance is just much, much stiffer than we had counted on. We've got to pump in much larger numbers of troops to make this happen. The butcher's bill offshore in terms of troop transports is much higher than we thought it was going to be. So I feel like if we had ended up doing Olympic, there's no way Coronet's going down in March of 46. Chris, where do you come down on that?
Well, I'm thinking that if you've chosen not to use the atomic bomb, I think the time you choose to use it is when Kyushu goes wrong for you, because it exactly proves why you need to use it. So I think what would have happened, I mean, oddly enough, if that had been the case, it probably would have been Hiroshima and Kyoto, not Nagasaki, because you've probably got troops ashore and around Nagasaki, and you don't want to explode a nuclear weapon there.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah.
So, you're going to make the decision at that point to say, you know what, we tried it. You were wrong, MacArthur. We're now gonna use the atomic bomb on maybe Tokyo, actually.
Well, that's very interesting. But I mean, was this not, if, let's say, and this is obviously hypothetical and this is not what happened, but let's say the Manhattan Project isn't ready in time and the bombs aren't there. This is your only plan, isn't it?
No, it isn't, because there is another plan which says you can firebomb everybody on these islands, starve them, blockade them. And that was an option. That's going to take a long time. So there's lots of people dying around Asia. You've got your own 285 interned and prisoners of war you've got to worry about. Japanese people you might want to worry about as well, despite what's happened. You've also paying for this war. At the end of the day, these are massive transfers of logistics and production that you need to bring across. So if Kyushu doesn't happen, I think you withdraw and say, we've got to rethink this.
Yeah.
Because either we go to blockade and firebomb and see how long they can last, and they would have lasted a long time, or we say, we need a totally different plan. We need to bring the Soviets in. Why don't we go somewhere else? Let's go to the north.
John, let's bring you in on this. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. Briefly on the idea that if the bombs are ready, you choose to drop them now, and you don't do Nagasaki. You maybe do Kyoto. You maybe do Tokyo.
They're not going to do Kyoto because Kyoto was off the target list. We had the war minister here in the U.S. was familiar enough with Japan to know that Kyoto was a priceless cultural sort of area, and so Kyoto had been explicitly taken off the map. Tokyo, on the other hand, was certainly not off the map, and I think probably would have been bombed because the gloves really were coming off at that point. We had no compunction about killing the emperor if need be. The other thing that I'll say is that I think that a blockade would have worked more quickly than some people think, because Japanese food distribution system internally is already falling apart, and it was totally dependent on the railway network. And if you look at the railways in Honshu, they stretch, north-south, and there's only a couple of trunk lines there, and a lot of them go through tunnels, and we knew that. And we were getting to the point in our bombardment schedule we were going to start taking those tunnels out. If you destroy the food distribution network, there's going to be mass starvation in Japan. And it's pretty clear that if this war had gone on any more than another month or two, you probably would have pushed Japan into starvation in the winter of 45, 46. And internal Japanese estimates say that they probably would have lost between 5 and 10 million civilians dead.
Is there not a scenario, though, Chris Parry, where if we're into 1946 and you've got the Americans on Kyushu, well, the Soviets are probably thinking, well, we'll come in from the north, we'll come in from Hokkaido, and then the Japanese are thinking, we've got a pincer movement here from both ends. And would that not potentially force them into a surrender? Yeah,
I mean, a lot of people are saying at this time, actually, the Soviets going into Hokkaido is actually a figment of Stalin's imagination. The Russians don't actually have the shipping for it at the time. They certainly don't have the logistics to be able to do that. The threat of it, though, might be an issue. And it was a consideration at the time of the surrender. What if they step across to Hokkaido? They could do it within 10 days. So that's on the Japanese mind. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, as long as you're killing Americans and Australians, we're winning.
Yeah.
And John mentioned earlier the power of propaganda. You see a lot of things in Japanese literature and propaganda at the time is, it doesn't matter that we're suffering, they're suffering more than we are.
Yeah.
And it's a very odd logic, but that's actually in their mind at the time. And in the 21st century, it's very difficult to project back to that sort of mentality. But before even sort of downfall was thought about, they were saying in Japan, bring it on. We want it as soon as possible. There's 100 million people here ready to die for the emperor. And you see it in the literature of the time. And that mentality prevails right to the end. So wearing them down, whether it's by starvation, by firebombing, by direct invasion, it was always going to cause millions of deaths. There's no question about that. And so I agree with John. You know, my moral basis for the dropping of the 2 bombs is exactly that. The math stacks up in favor of saying, look, hundreds of thousands of people against millions would have died if it had to be ended this way.
And John, if downfall had been played out to its logical conclusion, and let's say after Olympic you then go ahead with Coronet, when does it all finish? I mean, you know, when are we thinking that the war ends under that scenario? Is it 1947? Is it later still?
I honestly think that there was an appreciation on the part of the Big Six that there was increasing levels of civilian unrest. And, you know, it's one thing for the Big Six to say that, yeah, we're willing to sacrifice 100 million people. Actually, there weren't. There were only 70 million in Japan. That's more of a propaganda slogan. It sort of takes into the regions that they occupied. Anyway, you know, the Big Six may be willing to say that, but I don't think your average Japanese civilian was really ready to go there. If you start looking at the latter stages of the Okinawa campaign again, you'll start to see that there was a cracking of not only civilian morale, but military morale as well. And there were larger surrenders at the end of that campaign. I think Japan is going to fall apart by the spring of 1946 through starvation. And that eventually the civilians will just be like, we're done. This is stupid. We're not doing this anymore. So I don't think the war is going to go longer than the spring or summer of 1946, just because physically the Japanese people couldn't do it anymore. But, you know, getting to that point means, again, millions of deaths.
I mean, there is another way of looking about this. You know, you look at the geography of this, and I'm familiar with this as you are, John. You know, there's another solution to this. It's this area here. If you know that you've got 900,000 people, this is the biggest prisoner of war camp in the world at this point, if you land here. And you know Shikoku is actually quite a good island to land on. You can actually get your airfields here. And over Oita and Beppu, this bay here is fantastic. And I've never seen a plan that says, let's go in here, because you split the Japanese completely.
And the even more ambitious way to go about that is to say, you know what, we're going to go right into Tokyo right off the get-go. We've got enough carriers to project local air power over this battlefield infinitely. And so we're just going to do that, because by betting the ranch on Kyushu, a lot of the divisions that might have been up in Tokyo are now down in Kyushu, right? And so the beach defenses around Tokyo are nothing to write home about at this point. And so you might have had an opportunity to wrong foot them and just go directly into the Kanto Plain, and because that is where the bulk of Japan's population is, that's where the bulk of the remaining manufacturing is. Just go right in and, you know, decapitate the government and win.
I mean, the obvious thing to do is to feint here, to do a feint offshore, and then, as you say, either go somewhere else in the inland sea here, or you go up to Tokyo. It's interesting that there was no flexibility other than to do this steamroller effect.
Right. And to that point, I would add, too, that a lot of people look at the invasion of Iwo Jima and they say that was a waste, you know, but in this counterfactual scenario now, the fact that I own Iwo Jima, which is within ferrying range for my land-based aircraft, if I go in and grab Tokyo and grab some airfields around there, now I can fly Mustangs in from the Marianas, hopping up to Iwo, and then up to the Kanto Plain.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Of course, we know that Operation Downfall did not go ahead. But let's go with this and ask ourselves, had it gone ahead, what some of the long-term historical consequences might have been. Okay, let's get into some big long-term historical consequences now of what happens if Operation Downfall goes ahead and the bombs don't get dropped. John Parshall, to start with you. Politically, I mean, the implications for US politics are fascinating. Harry Truman would have, in this scenario, decided not to drop the bomb, to probably sacrifice many more American lives pursuing Operation Downfall. Under that scenario, and the war goes on for longer, maybe into 1946 or who knows when, does he get re-elected in 1948?
No. I can say that fairly conclusively. And I actually prefer the scenario that says that there's some technical glitch with the Manhattan Project, or we don't have enough uranium, or I don't know. Because I'm pretty sure that Truman was going to drop the bomb regardless, because he understood the political implications from not dropping the bomb.
And you think any US president, whoever it was, had FDR lived, or whoever it was, would have dropped the bomb?
Absolutely. Again, we have the luxury at 80 years removed to spread our analytical lens to look at what's happening throughout wider Asia. But the U.S. president's job in 1945 is to win this war as quickly and economically as possible, and with as few American boys dead as possible. So Truman, he's going to reach for every tool in the tool chest, and he's going to drop that bomb.
That's really interesting. So in that scenario, if he doesn't do it and this goes on, then he loses in 48 to Thomas Dewey. You probably don't get President Eisenhower, and then the whole timeline of US presidential politics in the back half of the 20th century, very, very different. A key thing I think to mention, Chris Parry, is if you haven't had the atomic bombs being dropped, does that change the entire way we view nuclear warfare? Because one of the lasting impacts of it is, we haven't had a nuclear strike since, because people have thought, well, we don't want that again. But in this scenario, that hasn't happened. So do you end up with the Soviets potentially developing a nuclear weapon and then deciding to drop it?
Yeah, I think we're on the cusp of actually rethinking nuclear theology. We're seeing 5 countries in the world today saying nuclear weapons, they're not just deterrent weapons, they're warfighting weapons. We've just had President Putin talking about using nuclear weapons as warfighting weapons. The Chinese have said there are certain red lines that we might actually use a nuclear weapon, particularly at sea. So that's coming back into the framework again. So the horror of all of that and its power is not deterring people from thinking about them as warfighting weapons again.
But that's almost 80 years on, though. It's kept the peace for a long time.
It has. There's no question about that. They've kept the peace. There's another implication of this war continuing without the use of the nuclear weapons. Part of the operation for Operation Downfall had the British Pacific Fleet involved. Now, Admiral King, the Chief of Naval Operations, said, we don't want the British here. They're a liability. He said it very rudely once at the Combined Chiefs. And frankly, we know what the British are here to do. They're here to re-establish their empire again. Now, I'm going to stick my neck out and say, had the Americans been focused on reducing Japan, you'll have seen the French, the British, and the Dutch saying, you know what, we're going to reimpose our empire now, because you're quite busy up here. We're going to go here and say, we're going to pick up where we left off.
Could they really have afforded to do that, though?
Yeah, and of course, there's no question that if you've got the forces to do it, as you heard earlier, there's vast amounts of starvation. There's a lot of humanitarian needed here.
Yeah.
And actually, you're getting raw materials and oil out of this. So if the Americans aren't out of this, it gives a gap for everybody to say, you know what, we're walking straight back into our empires again.
Ah, that's interesting, because you would say the natural resources on offer would make it almost pay for itself.
Absolutely.
I mean, John, that's a very interesting one. Do you go with that?
Yeah, I've never considered that before, but I think it's a fair enough cop to say, yeah, the Americans are really busy right at the moment, and there might be some opportunities down here. I don't think that the long-term trajectory of those empires is any different in that, certainly in the case of the Dutch, there were 80,000 Dutch trying to ride herd over 80 million Indonesians. That's never going to work. So perhaps you see a short-term staving off of the collapse of the British and French empires in the Far East, but I think at the end of the day, you still get the same general geopolitical.
I agree with that, John. But the short-term impact would have had a counterfactual of its own. So if the French are establishing themselves much earlier, what happens in Vietnam? So that then has a knock-on effect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You find that the Australians may be more involved in this area, as they are now, of course. So I think the dynamic of it changes in the short term, and there are domino effects that roll on into the future. But I do agree with you, the liberation movements, particularly associated with China and the other countries, are very strong at this stage. And you're right too, James, the level of deprivation, all that sort of thing is very difficult. But there was a window of opportunity there for the old colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, particularly Britain as well, actually.
And just finally, John, I wonder what the impact would have been on Japan long term. And you used to live in Japan, you lived in Hiroshima even for a time. if the bombs aren't dropped, and if Operation Downfall had gone ahead, what is the impact on Japan, which of course post-war went on to become a liberal democracy, an economic superpower in the 1980s? What does Japan look like now if the bombs aren't dropped?
I still like to think that Japan is a liberal democracy. However, there might have been a Soviet occupation zone in the northern part of the country if the war drags on. I look at Germany, which of course we essentially paved in the final stages of that war, and they too became a staunch ally and a liberal democracy. And so I would like to think that that would have happened in Japan as well. But I shudder to think about the cost in human life to bring that about.
Chris, final thought from you?
Yeah, I think that's a significant emotional and psychological footprint. We talk about the mass deaths in Russia and, of course, in the Holocaust. Can you imagine a Holocaust of that nature, 10 to 20 million people? The psychological footprint on a population would be huge.
Well, look, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think what we've learned is that had Operation Downfall gone ahead, had the atomic bombs either not been ready or Truman had decided for whatever reason not to drop them, first of all, the political consequence on Harry Truman would have been enormous. Any US president who decided not to end the war in 1945, but instead allow it to drag on into 1946, possibly beyond, with the loss of probably hundreds of thousands of American lives as a result, would almost certainly have then lost the presidential election in 1948. If that happens and you get Thomas Dewey presumably winning in 1948, the entire presidential history of the back half of the 20th century looks incredibly different. Then about what about the wider regional implications? If you've got America tied up with Operation Downfall, do you get some of the old European imperial powers deciding, we can reassert our dominance here? So you get the French in Indochina, you get the British coming back into the region, the Dutch in the East Indies. Does that happen? Maybe it doesn't preserve their colonies and their empires for long, but it certainly might prop it up for a bit longer. And if you've got the French in a different situation in Indochina, does the Vietnam War then happen? That's a very big counterfactual. And then interestingly, what happens with the Soviets? Then do they decide to then enter Hokkaido and go for Japan? Maybe not, but maybe. And crucially, what is the long-term impact on Japan itself, which in the back half of the 20th century became a very successful liberal democracy, one of the world's most successful economies? Does that happen if the atomic bombs aren't dropped? We will never know, but it's a fascinating question to ponder. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to John and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.